Faster Than a Wimper, by Stephen Lake. Darren quietly dug into his birthday cake and savored its delicious, sweet flavor. He'd just turned 16, and earned his driver's license, and now all he needed was a car to make full use of his newly found freedom. But, the way his luck ran, he was more likely to get another set of clothes for his birthday rather than anything on four wheels like he wanted. He quietly studied his parents, who sat across the table from him and beamed with excitement as his other siblings noisily ate their cake, and talked about the latest gossip from school, the latest toys on TV, and a multitude of other things. Darren, however, only cared about one thing. He was old enough now, and wanted a car. "So, dear, what would you like for your birthday this year?" asked his mom. Darren raised an eyebrow at this. It was his birthday, and they were just now asking him this? It was a little late for them to be bringing that up now, as they should have been asking him about that weeks, or even months ago. "A car would be nice," he said as he poked at his cake. He'd only said that as he didn't actually think he'd get one, but still wanted to remind his parents that having one was definitely on his list of near-future priorities. To his surprise, however, the look in their eyes told him that something was up, and it was likely going to be anything but what he wanted. He soon put down his fork and looked at them suspiciously. "What are you two planning?" he asked. The joy on his parents' faces grew even more exalted than before. "Come with us, son. We have a little surprise for you," said his dad. Darren cocked an eyebrow at this, but willingly followed them across the house anyways. However, when they arrived, the looks on their faces grew even more bothersome for him. He then watched as his dad pointed out the front door at something in the driveway. Darren stepped up next to his parents and soon spotted a small, beat-up old Pinto, with a bow on top, sitting in the driveway. He groaned quietly at this. "Oh Mom, Dad, you didn't," he thought. "Happy birthday, Darren. What do you think of your new car?" "It's your birthday present," said his mom excitedly. "They did," he groaned to himself. "Your mother and I went to a lot of trouble to find you the perfect car." "I hope you enjoy it," said his dad proudly. "I'll be lucky if I don't die from embarrassment, or the car doesn't blow up the moment I turn over the key." "Man, I swear, my parents hate me," thought Darren. His dad then handed him the keys, and said, "Go take it for a test drive." Not wanting to disappoint his parents, Darren walked out to the car, opened the grungy, rust-pitted door, and grimaced as it squeaked. The noise it made sounded like someone was torturing a cat. He plopped down into the seat and felt springs invade his pants. If it wasn't for the fact that his jeans were already fashionably torn, he might have found this troublesome. Then again, the idea of having a seat full of springs potentially giving him a running enema didn't sit well with him either. He got up, tossed a towel down on the seat, and then sat back down again. He felt the car sag to one side as though it threatened to tip over at any moment. This had to be a joke. No parents were this cruel. He then glanced back at the smiling faces of his mom and dad. He immediately recanted that thought. They were definitely the worst parents ever. He soon put the key in the ignition and turned it. A painful, grinding noise came from under the hood, followed by a sound that he couldn't quite describe. It was like 100 monkeys were dueling it out under the hood with jackhammers. He prayed quietly under his breath that the car would spontaneously catch fire and burn to the ground. That would be the most merciful thing that could happen to him. But, alas, it didn't. So he situated himself in the front seat, pulled the door shut, and put it in reverse. The transmission then cried out like a herd of stampeding elephants. He quietly wondered how many other members of the animal kingdom had been unceremoniously crammed into this wreck on wheels. He released the brake, and then grimaced as the car painfully slid down the driveway, bounced into the street, and came to a halt just beyond the driveway. He put it in drive and listened as the herd of elephants turned into a blender full of crows. He gave the engine a little bit of gas and felt it struggle forward, causing the car to shake like a tree in a windstorm. It then struggled down the road, and soon vanished around the corner. He returned an hour later on foot, looking somewhat disheveled, carrying the only surviving piece of his car in his hands, the steering wheel. His parents were surprised by this. "Honey, "Where's your car?" asked his mom. Darren pointed to a flatbed wrecker as it turned the corner behind him. On its bed lay a pile of metallic carnage that looked like salvage parts on their way to the junkyard. "Oh dear. Did it break already?" she asked. Darren handed her the steering wheel and said, "Gee Mom, you take a guess." He then stormed off to his room and plopped down on the bed. Worst birthday ever. His parents, knowing that they had clearly chosen badly in buying the Pinto as his first car, decided that they were going to make it right, no matter what. Later that week, Darren was awoken to a sound akin to a lion's roar, mixed with the thunder of a hurricane. He immediately sat up in bed and craned his ear towards the window. The noise soon stopped. Clearly something had pulled into his driveway. But what could it be? There wasn't any cars they owned that he knew of that sounded like that. "Darren, sweetie. Come here please," came his mom's voice a moment later. Darren immediately bolted out of bed, got dressed, and then hurried across the house. Was it possible that they got him a Trans Am, or another similar sports car like he wanted in consolation for the humiliation they had put him through just 2 days earlier? He raced up to his mom, who held out a shiny new key to him, snatched it from her hands, and then bolted out into the driveway. However, when he got there, all he found was yet another Pinto. The big difference was, this one was painted ghost white, and was rust-free, whereas the other one had been a walking rust bucket with 3.5 tires in the junkyard. Uncertain what to make of this, he walked up to the car cautiously and examined it with great care. His mom soon joined him in the driveway. "This one's to replace the other car that broke on you," she said. "But, Mom, it's still a Pinto," moaned Darren. "Yes, I know. We contacted the dealer about that, and he willingly agreed to exchange it for this one, as the other Pinto we bought you had a few minor problems with it." "A few," thought Darren sarcastically. Curious to see if this car was better than the other one, he grabbed the handle and opened the door. It swung out smoothly, without a sound, or even so much as a single creak. That was at least promising. He then looked inside and found the interior to be nearly flawless and with no signs of wear or tear anywhere. That was even more promising. He soon climbed inside, and was glad to find that the driver's seat hadn't tried to molest him with its springs like the last one had. He also noticed that the car wasn't sagging like the other one had either. So far, he was impressed with how much better this one was. It was still a Pinto, but at least one that was in decent condition. He cautiously put the key in the ignition and started the car. The engine immediately roared to life, with the sounds that came out of it sending chills down his spine. It was as though a lion had just awoken and roared with excitement before settling down into a gentle purr in anticipation of the hunt. A satisfied grin grew across Darren's face until he couldn't grin any wider. He closed the door, put on his seatbelt, and put the car in reverse. He felt the car lurch as the engine tried desperately to overpower the brakes as though two superpowers were vying for supremacy. This was not your typical Pinto. He carefully eased off the brake and felt the car shoot out into the street. So much so, in fact, that he had to fight it with all his might not to end up in the living room of the house across the street. He then dropped it into drive and once again felt the car lurch under him. "Mwahaha," he said as he grinned with devilish glee. He let off the brake and watched as the car quickly accelerated on its own to 25 miles an hour. If the car would do that at idle, he wondered what it would do if he touched the gas. His neck would regret that decision for the rest of the day as the car's tires barked briefly, and then locked into the pavement, launching the car down the road like a rocket. Darren struggled just to hold onto the steering wheel as the force of acceleration crushed him against the seat. Before he knew it, he was clocking 90 in a residential district. Along the way he passed a cop sitting by the road running a speed trap. As his ghost white Pinto sailed by, the younger deputy saw the speed it was traveling at, and tapped his partner on the shoulder. "Hey, check it out. A Pinto just blew past us doing 90, he exclaimed. The senior officer roused, smacked his lips, and then stared at his subordinate. "You're seeing things, son. There ain't no Pinto on God's green earth that can do 90. Now, Do we need to go back to the station and have your eyes checked? The younger officer, fearing another reprimand, shook his head. No, sir, he said. Good, now let's go grab some coffee and donuts. I'm hungry. Realizing that he was now going way too fast, and risked getting into a wreck if he didn't bring the car under control, Darren pressed as hard as he could on the brakes. But the car refused to stop. Panicking slightly, he shifted the car into neutral. This allowed him to finally bring the car to a stop at a nearby intersection. As he sat there waiting for the light to change, a very powerful sports car, owned by one of the jocks at school, pulled up to the stoplight next to him. Darren glanced over at him and saw who it was. A devilish grin soon spread across his face. He leaned out his window and shouted, "Hey, Pinhead! You want a race?" The jock turned to him, partially lowered his sunglasses, and glared arrogantly at the ghost white Pinto and its driver. "Ha! You want to race me in that?" he shouted condescendingly. "I bet I can beat you to the next intersection." "Winner takes all," said Darren. The jock grinned greedily. "You're on, nerd boy," he said. The jock then raised his sunglasses, looked up at the light, and said, "Green is mean, and you better be hot." Darren looked up at the stoplight, and grinned. He put the car in gear and waited for the light to change. A moment later it did, and to the jock's complete surprise, a roar came out of the little Pinto that sent chills down the frame of his sports car. The jock tried his best to catch the little white ghost, but found that it left him so thoroughly in the dust that it was like he had been driving a rock. A little ways up the street they came to another stoplight. "What you got under that hood?" he cried. "None your business, punk," said Darren gleefully. The jock looked at him in confusion. No Pinto was that good. This had to be a fluke. "Best 2 out of 3, kid," he eventually said. Darren grinned. There was nothing better than rubbing it in. "Green is mean, and you better be hot," he said to the jock as he repeated his earlier words back to him. And in both of the next 2 lights he beat the jock, in his fancy sports car, hands down. At the 3rd light the 2 switched cars, with Darren giving him the keys to his Pinto, and the jock handing over the keys to his sports car. The jock then got in, dropped it in gear, and was gone like a cannon shot down Main Street, onto the highway, and across the Bay Bridge like someone had mounted a pair of warp drives onto the little car. Darren then drove the jock's sports car around town for the rest of the day as he tried his best to enjoy it. But somehow he felt lost without his little car. He eventually drove the car back to the house of the jock, and then took a bus home. Later that evening, the jock arrived at his house, his face and hands almost as ghost white as the car, and returned the little white Pinto to its rightful owner. But it wasn't because he'd gotten his fill. Instead, Darren noticed that the engine no longer roared, and the body sagged as though the car was now sad. He didn't think much of it at the time, but definitely felt it the next day. The car was now no longer spunky, didn't roar anymore, and didn't want to go like the wind as it had the previous day. Instead, it seemed content to just quietly putter down the road. Even so, for weeks afterwards Darren proudly drove the car everywhere, never pushing it around, or asking more from it than to merely get him to and from school and his afternoon job. Even so, the little car had made a name for itself, and its fame quickly spread all over the countryside. One day, as Darren arrived at school, he found the south end of the parking lot full of powerful street cars, all growling and roaring with anticipation at a chance to race him. Darren stared in disbelief at this, unwilling to believe that all these cars were there to race him, to prove their power and muscle against a ridiculously overpowered little Pinto. As he pulled into the parking lot, he stopped next to the first car in line, and rolled down his window. "What are you guys here for?" he asked, even though he knew the answer. "To race you, of course," said the car's owner. "Sure, I can do that. But not until after school," he said. The other car owners seemed disappointed at this, but willingly agreed. As the other cars all pulled away, with plans to return that afternoon to race him, Darren pulled into a parking spot, and then gunned the engine. However, unlike before, it gave out a weak and almost sad growl. Darren was a bit worried at this. "You all right, bud?" he asked the little car. But its sad, heartless whimper made him realize what he'd done wrong. "You're upset that I traded you for that other guy's sports car, aren't you?" he asked. The car replied with a weak and disappointed growl. This broke Darren's heart. "I'm sorry, man. I shouldn't have done that. Will you forgive me?" he asked. But the car didn't respond. It just continued to idle with no reaction to his words. Now Darren felt like a complete and total jerk. "Hey, I know what I did to you before was wrong. So why don't I make this up to you? Do you want to go ahead and race some more? I mean, there's a bunch of cars out there that look down on you for who you are. So why don't we show them that they're not King Piston around here," said Darren. The little car seemed to ponder this briefly, before grinning slyly as only cars can do. It then revved its engine and roared like a lion, as if to say, "Let's do it." The end.